August 1944. In the western United States, far from the ruins of European cities and the thunder of advancing armies, a train slowed beside a fenced compound built hurriedly on dry ground. Beyond the wire, the land lay flat and pale under a wide sky. There were no cheering crowds here, no flags, no speeches. Only the dull scrape of boots on gravel, the creak of gates, and the low instructions of guards spoken in a language not yet understood by those stepping down from the rail cars. In Europe, the summer of 1944 was remembered for liberation and momentum. Newspapers spoke of victories, of fronts collapsing, of an inevitable end. Official histories would later describe movements of divisions and the shifting lines on maps. Yet at this same moment, removed from the headlines, a smaller and quieter history unfolded. One measured not in territory but in waiting, routine, and the slow adjustment of minds to captivity. The women who arrived at this camp were German nationals, captured in various circumstances as the war expanded and collapsed around them. Some had served in auxiliary roles. Others had been seized during the chaos of retreat or occupation. They were not soldiers in the popular imagination of the war, and they would not appear in photographs of surrender or victory. Their names were recorded in ledgers. Their identities reduced to numbers stitched onto worn clothing. They were classified, processed, and assigned bunks beneath wooden roofs that trapped heat during the day and released it sharply at night. The camp itself was orderly, almost spare. Barracks stood in rows. A mess hall sat at the center, its windows clouded with steam at certain hours of the day. The soundscape was repetitive, a bell to mark meals, footsteps during roll call, the distant hum of trucks on a road that led elsewhere. Inside the barracks, there was the smell of disinfectant, of damp wool uniforms, of dust carried in on shoes. Silence often filled the spaces between these sensations, heavy and unspoken. Food was a central fact of daily life. It structured the day more firmly than clocks. The women arrived thin, accustomed to rationing, to substitutions, to meals that ended before hunger did. Bread had been dark and coarse. Fat scarce. Cheese, when available at all, was reserved for the sick or the very young. Hunger was not dramatic. It was constant, a background condition that shaped thought and memory alike. In the camp, meals followed a schedule and a standard. Portions were counted. Ingredients were unfamiliar. There were smells that did not match expectation. Milk heated generously, butter melting without apology, bread sliced thick and pale. The women noticed these details without comment, as one notices changes in weather while confined indoors. Curiosity was tempered by caution. Nothing here was entirely without meaning. On one particular afternoon, the mess hall was louder than usual. Metal trays slid along counters. A radio played faintly somewhere beyond the kitchen wall, its signal wavering. The women took their places on long benches, sitting close, shoulders almost touching. Before them were plates carrying something simple and warm. 2 slices of white bread, browned and crisp, pressed together with melted cheese that had softened to the point of surrender. The surface glistened. Steam escaped when it was broken apart. For the guards and kitchen staff, it was an ordinary meal. For the women it was not. The texture was unexpected. The richness lingered. The taste carried no memory of scarcity or substitution. It was not celebratory food nor ceremonial. It was practical, plentiful, and prepared without visible concern for economy. Some ate quickly as habit demanded. Others hesitated, observing the way the cheese stretched, the way grease soaked into the bread. No one spoke loudly. Reactions were internal, measured, restrained. This moment did not alter the conditions of captivity. The fences remained. The war continued elsewhere. Yet something unsettled had been introduced, not comfort, not gratitude, but a quiet dissonance. The women had been raised on narratives of enemy brutality and moral certainty. They now encountered, without explanation, a daily life that contradicted expectation in small, persistent ways. Kindness appeared without announcement. Abundance existed alongside imprisonment. Diaries would later record these details without emphasis. A meal. A taste. A silence that followed. There was no immediate conclusion drawn, no sudden change of allegiance or belief. Only the slow accumulation of contradiction, absorbed alongside routine. The grilled cheese sandwich, unremarkable in itself, became a point of sensory memory, a warmth held briefly between the hands in a place defined by waiting. History rarely pauses on such moments. Yet within them lies a question that resists simple answers. What happens when the enemy feeds you better than your own country ever could? Morning in the camp began without ceremony. A whistle sounded before sunrise, thin and metallic, cutting through sleep rather than gently ending it. The women rose from narrow bunks arranged in rows, blankets folded with care not out of pride but habit. The barracks smelled of wood, wool, and bodies confined too long to the same space. Windows were small and often left cracked, letting in air that carried dust and, in summer, heat that settled heavily on the skin. Roll call followed. Names were called in accented German or clipped English, depending on the guard. The women stood still, eyes forward, hands at their sides or clasped behind their backs. The ground beneath their shoes was packed dirt or gravel, uneven and unforgiving. There was no music, no marching cadence. Just counting. Just confirmation that no one had disappeared in the night. After roll call came breakfast. The mess hall was functional, built for efficiency rather than comfort. Long tables, benches fixed to the floor, light filtering in through high windows. Trays were distributed, each identical in content. Bread, pale and soft. Coffee that was more hot water than bean but plentiful. Occasionally eggs. Sometimes oatmeal, steaming with sugar available in small bowls. The women ate quietly, the scrape of cutlery against tin plates filling the room. Hunger ensured compliance. Complaints were rare and muted. For many of the women, the routine itself was unsettling. Captivity, as they had imagined it, was supposed to be harsh and visibly cruel. Instead, it was orderly and restrained. Guards were firm but distant. Discipline existed, but it was procedural rather than punitive. Punishments, when they occurred, were bureaucratic. Loss of privileges, extra work, confinement to quarters. Violence was not absent from the camp's authority, but it was contained, almost reluctant. Work assignments followed breakfast. Some women were sent to kitchens, others to laundry rooms where steam hung thick in the air and the smell of soap clung to hair and clothing. There were fields to tend, storerooms to organize, floors to scrub. The tasks were repetitive and deliberately dull. Time passed slowly, measured by bells and the lengthening or shortening of shadows outside the buildings. In the laundry, hands grew raw from hot water and detergent. In the kitchens, the women handled ingredients they had rarely seen in such quantities. Sacks of flour, blocks of butter, crates of canned goods. They were instructed carefully, supervised by American personnel or fellow prisoners deemed reliable. Mistakes were corrected calmly. Efficiency mattered more than obedience. It was here, amid these routines, that the first cracks appeared, not in discipline but in certainty. The women noticed how casually food was used. Butter spread thickly rather than scraped thin. Milk poured without calculation. Cheese cut generously without weighing. Waste, when it occurred, was not punished severely. These observations lodged themselves quietly in the mind, uninvited and persistent. In letters never sent and diaries hidden beneath mattresses, the women recorded their days. The entries were sparse. Dates, weather, work details. Occasionally, a sentence about food. Cheese again today. White bread. Warm. The words were not emotional, but repetition gave them weight. Food, once a background concern in civilian life, had become a lens through which everything else was judged. The grilled cheese sandwiches appeared at midday meals, not daily but often enough to become familiar. They were prepared in large batches on flat griddles, bread buttered on the outside, cheese placed thickly between slices. The smell traveled ahead of them, filling the mess hall before the trays arrived. It was a smell associated not with scarcity but with comfort, something many of the women had not encountered since before the war. At first, reactions were guarded. Some women ate mechanically, eyes lowered, refusing to acknowledge pleasure. Others examined the sandwiches closely as if searching for a hidden cost. A few whispered remarks in German, quickly silenced by habit rather than fear. There was no rule against conversation, but restraint had become second nature. One woman later recalled the sound the sandwich made when pulled apart. A soft resistance. The cheese stretching before breaking. She wrote that it reminded her of childhood, of a kitchen that no longer existed, of a mother who had learned to cook without fat, without milk, without complaint. The memory was not comforting. It was disorienting. The guards observed these meals without comment. Most were young men, some barely older than the prisoners they watched. Their duties were repetitive and rarely dramatic. They checked counts, enforced schedules, and maintained distance. Few spoke German. Fewer still asked questions. For them, the women were part of an assignment far removed from the front lines and the violence that defined the war elsewhere. Yet even among the guards there were moments of attention. One officer noted in a report that the women appeared healthier after several months in camp. Weight gained. Color returned to faces. Illness decreased. The observation was clinical, stripped of interpretation. It was filed alongside supply inventories and maintenance requests. The women noticed these changes in one another. Cheeks filled out. Hair lost some of its brittleness. Menstrual cycles, disrupted by stress and hunger, slowly returned. These bodily shifts were private, rarely discussed, but deeply felt. They complicated the internal narrative of suffering that captivity was supposed to confirm. Ideological certainty did not dissolve quickly. Many of the women had grown up under years of propaganda that framed Americans as decadent, cruel, or racially inferior. These ideas did not disappear at the sight of a sandwich. Instead, they bent awkwardly around daily experience. Explanations were sought. Perhaps this was indulgence meant to weaken resolve. Perhaps it was temporary, a show for inspection. Perhaps abundance masked a deeper moral emptiness. But the days passed and the food remained consistent. There was no dramatic shift. No sudden deprivation. The women were not interrogated during meals, not pressured to express gratitude. The sandwiches arrived, warm and unremarkable, then disappeared once eaten. Afternoons stretched long. Work resumed. Some women were assigned to classrooms where English lessons were offered, ostensibly to aid communication and compliance. Participation was optional but encouraged. The lessons were basic. Words for objects. Simple phrases. The women repeated sounds unfamiliar to their tongues. Language, like food, became another side of contradiction, an enemy offering tools rather than taking them away. In quieter moments, conversations emerged. Not arguments, but questions spoken softly between trusted companions. Is this how they live? Is this normal for them? What will happen when we go home? No one answered with confidence. Home itself had become an uncertain concept, reshaped by bombing, displacement, and loss. One woman, assigned to kitchen duty, observed American cooks preparing food for themselves after the prisoners' meals were served. The portions were similar. There was no visible hierarchy in ingredients. She noted this carefully, writing later that it disturbed her more than outright cruelty would have. Inequality she could understand. This resemblance was harder to process. Sundays were different. Work slowed. Some guards attended services. The women were allowed more time outdoors. They walked within designated areas, the fence always in view, its wire catching the light. Conversations wandered. Memories surfaced. Some spoke of husbands or brothers at the front. Others avoided such topics entirely. The war, omnipresent yet distant, pressed in from all sides without fully entering the camp. Food on Sundays was slightly improved. Desserts appeared, simple cakes, sometimes fruit. The grilled cheese sandwiches were absent on these days, replaced by roasts or stews. Their absence was noticed. Their return during the week carried renewed significance, though no one named it. Occasionally visitors toured the camp. Inspectors, Red Cross representatives, officials whose presence altered behavior subtly. The camp was cleaned thoroughly beforehand. Menus were followed precisely. The women were instructed on conduct, though little needed correction. After the visitors left, life resumed its previous rhythm. The sandwiches returned. The women's internal landscapes shifted gradually. Not toward loyalty or affection but toward confusion. The enemy was no longer a distant abstraction. It had hands that buttered bread. It had routines that mirrored their own. It had abundance where they had known lack. Yet captivity remained captivity. Letters home were censored or delayed. News from Europe arrived sporadically and often secondhand. Some women received word of destroyed cities, of missing family members. Grief moved through the barracks quietly without spectacle. There were nights of muffled sobbing, faces pressed into pillows to contain sound. In these moments, the memory of warm food could feel almost cruel. Comfort sat uneasily beside loss. The sandwiches did not erase pain, they complicated it. They raised questions without offering relief. Guards noticed changes in demeanor. Some women became more withdrawn. Others more observant, asking careful questions about American life, about farms, factories, families. The guards answered cautiously or deflected. They were not instructed to persuade, only to manage. By late 1944, the camp had settled into a stable pattern. The women could predict meals, work assignments, weather shifts. Stability itself became unsettling. The war beyond the fence grew closer to its end, but inside, time seemed suspended. One diary entry, dated simply November, described the act of eating a grilled cheese sandwich slowly, deliberately. The writer noted the warmth in her hands, the quiet of the room, the absence of alarms. She wrote that she felt neither gratitude nor anger, only a strange distance from herself. As if, she wrote, I am watching someone else eat. This dissociation was not uncommon. The women inhabited a space between identities, no longer civilians, not soldiers, not free. Food anchored them physically while loosening ideological ground beneath their feet. There were moments of resistance, small and private. Some women refused certain foods, claiming illness or distaste. Others shared portions with those who struggled emotionally, creating informal networks of care. These acts were not organized or political. They were personal, instinctive. As winter approached, the grilled cheese sandwiches became more frequent. Warm food was practical in the cold. The mess hall windows fogged over. Outside, frost gathered on the fence wire. Inside, the smell of melted cheese mingled with damp wool and would smoke from nearby heaters. The women ate. They waited. They thought. No single moment marked a transformation. There was no declaration, no conversion. Only accumulation. Taste layered upon memory. Routine pressing against belief. The sandwiches, ordinary and consistent, became symbols without intention, objects through which the women confronted a reality that did not align neatly with what they had been taught. The conflict remained unresolved. Captivity continued. The war raged on elsewhere. And within the camp, each meal quietly deepened a tension that could not yet be named, only felt, lingering long after the plates were cleared and the benches emptied. The end did not arrive with ceremony. There was no single day when the fences vanished or the routines dissolved into memory. Instead, separation came in stages. Orders read aloud, lists posted, belongings gathered and repacked into the same small bundles carried months earlier. The barracks emptied unevenly. Some women left in groups, others waited longer, their names lingering on rosters as circumstances elsewhere determined their movement. The camp grew quieter, not suddenly but through absence. On the final mornings, meals were still served. The mess hall remained in use until the end, its tables wiped clean, its benches aligned. The food did not change to mark departure. There were no final gestures. For some of the women, the last meal included the same familiar sandwich. Bread browned on the outside, cheese melted through the center. It was eaten without comment. The act had long since lost its novelty, replaced by something closer to resignation. When the women departed, they passed again through gates that opened and closed with mechanical indifference. Guards watched, some with curiosity, others with the detachment that comes from repetition. There were no embraces, no words exchanged beyond instructions. Trucks and trains carried the women away, back across distances that now felt altered by time spent standing still. In the months and years that followed, accounts of captivity surfaced unevenly. Some women spoke freely when asked, describing routines, work, boredom, and the peculiar calm of life behind wire. Others remained silent, either by choice or because language failed to accommodate the contradictions they carried. When food was mentioned, it appeared as detail rather than theme: bread, milk, cheese. Ordinary words, stripped of explanation. In post-war Germany, scarcity returned with force. Cities lay broken. Ration cards reappeared. Hunger resumed its familiar pressure. In this landscape, memories of the camp took on a strange quality. Captivity was not something to be praised, yet it stood in contrast to the hardship that followed. The warmth of a grilled sandwich, remembered years later, could feel almost accusatory, an intrusion into a narrative that demanded suffering and endurance without complication. Some women attempted to dismiss these memories as irrelevant, a footnote to a much larger catastrophe. Others found that the smallest details persisted most stubbornly. The sound of bread pressed against a hot surface. The smell of butter browning. The weight of food held in the hands without urgency. These sensations returned uninvited, triggered by kitchens rebuilt from rubble or by the sudden availability of ingredients once thought lost forever. Official histories of the war made little space for such recollections. Women prisoners occupied a marginal position in records dominated by battles, leaders, and treaties. When camps in the United States were discussed at all, they appeared as logistical achievements or humanitarian obligations fulfilled. The inner lives of those confined within them remained largely unexamined. Yet among the women themselves, memory did not arrange itself so neatly. Captivity was recalled alongside other disruptions. Evacuation, bombardment, loss of family members, the long labor of reconstruction. The camp was neither an aberration nor a refuge, but a suspended interval that resisted easy classification. It existed between defeat and survival, between ideology and experience. In later interviews, some women struggled to articulate what troubled them most. It was not the fences which were expected, nor the rules which were clear. It was the dissonance, the quiet erosion of certainty caused by kindness offered without explanation, by abundance encountered in the hands of an enemy. The sandwiches, mentioned almost reluctantly, became shorthand for this unease. They represented a care that did not align with inherited beliefs, a generosity that complicated victimhood without erasing it. For others, the memory faded deliberately. Silence became a form of control. The war had demanded too much introspection already. To dwell on moments of unexpected comfort felt disloyal to the dead or to those who had endured worse. In this silence, the sensory details dulled but never disappeared entirely. American guards and officials, when they reflected at all, tended to remember the camps as orderly assignments, distant from the violence overseas. Some recalled the women as quiet, efficient workers. A few remembered shared glances across counters, small exchanges of courtesy that seemed insignificant at the time. Food, for them, was a logistical matter, supply chains managed successfully, morale maintained, standards upheld. Its psychological weight went largely unnoticed. Years later, as global narratives hardened around victory and defeat, the memory of a warm sandwich eaten in captivity sat awkwardly at the margins. It did not fit comfortably into stories of liberation or oppression. It suggested that war's moral landscape was uneven, shaped as much by daily gestures as by grand decisions. For the women who carried these memories, the paradox remained unresolved. They had been confined, classified, and controlled. They had also been fed consistently, sometimes generously, by those they had been taught to fear. Neither fact canceled the other. Together, they formed a memory resistant to simplification. In old age, some women returned to these moments quietly, often alone. The passage of time softened edges without clarifying meaning. The war receded into abstraction, but the tactile memories endured. Bread yielding under pressure. Cheese cooling as it stretched. The brief sense of warmth in a place defined by waiting. Such recollections did not demand gratitude or forgiveness. They did not revise the broader history of destruction and loss. They existed instead as reminders that even within systems built for control, ordinary human acts persisted, acts that could unsettle belief without announcing intent. The camps themselves disappeared. Barracks were dismantled or repurposed. Fields reclaimed the land. Only records and recollections remained, unevenly preserved. In these fragments, the grilled cheese sandwich appeared again and again, an unremarkable object burdened with unintended meaning. It did not symbolize freedom, nor did it absolve captivity. It marked a moment when the boundaries between enemy and provider blurred, when certainty gave way to confusion, and when the war revealed itself not only through violence, but through the quiet pressure of contradiction. In the end, what lingered was not the taste itself, but the question it raised and never answered: how something so simple could remain so deeply unsettling, long after the fences were gone and the plates cleared.